alphabet gets 3 verses. So chapter 1 begins with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, 1, 2, 3. Verse 4 begins with the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, 4, 5, 6. Verse 7 begins with the third letter. So each letter of the Hebrew alphabet has 3 verses. Then it's back to that original acrostic in chapter 4, and then chapter 5 drops the acrostic altogether. It still has 22 verses, but it does not follow the Hebrew alphabet. And some commentators think that's probably just because this last chapter is so passionate, that it's so much emotion and passion jumping off the page, that the writer could not contain that passion in a structure, in an acrostic structure. I need to take that for what it's worth. But I thought it was just, when you look at it in the Hebrew, and I don't speak Hebrew, I don't read Hebrew. I know enough Hebrew that I can open up a Hebrew lexicon, and I can find whatever definition to a word, and that is the extent of my Hebrew knowledge. But that is how the book of Lamentations is put together. So, like I said, there's a real intentionality to the way that these verses are put together. There's a poetry. Whoever wrote, and it's likely Jeremiah, whoever wrote the book of Lamentations really thought through this book as a presentation book. It's a book that's meant to be read out loud. It's a book that's meant to be celebrated. It's a book that's meant to be shared in. I mean, just screaming, like it's just jumping off the page, like this is something you got to read out loud. I've never listened to it or read it in Hebrew, but I imagine that in Hebrew there probably is much more of a rhythm than we have in our English translation. So, anyway, any thoughts along those lines? Yeah, go ahead.
I have a curiosity question, and I know there's no answer to this, but we know God breathed all Scripture.
Yeah.
So how much of the acrostic and the pattern and the poetry comes from God versus Jeremiah? I know you can't answer that,
yeah.
But it makes me wonder, did God put that in there? Or did Jeremiah take those poetic liberties to make it a really amazing piece of literature, really? I don't know. It's just an interesting thought.
Yeah, God is a God of order, right? There are things that are orderly in creation. There are things that line up the way that they should line up on a chemical level, on a geological level. There are the laws of physics. But there is an orderliness, and so it wouldn't surprise me that same orderliness, being a quality of God that permeates everything that He does, also would permeate His inspiration at times. And off the top of my head, I'm sorry, I can't produce for you other examples, but this is not the only acrostic literature in the Bible. Psalm 119. There you go. See? I couldn't think of one off the top of my head, right? Each section of verses in Psalm 119 corresponds to a Hebrew letter of their alphabet. So if Psalm 119 is the only one we can think of off the top of our head, there is at least one other. So it's just worth pondering. It shows that God, by His inspiration through Jeremiah, is one who appreciates a good rhyme. He's one who appreciates a good rhythm. Okay, we have the capacity for music. Where does that come from? We're created in God's image. Does God appreciate music? Did we invent music, or did God invent music? I mean, invent, what I mean by that. I think because we're created in God's image, our appreciation for rhyming, our appreciation for a drum beat, our appreciation for rhythm, music, lyricism, lyrical notes, I think that comes from God. I think that's inspired. That's a part of us that's certainly not evolution certainly doesn't have any kind of explanation for why we like a nice rhyme. I love rhymes. I love rhyming. That's something, I don't know if you know that about me. You've learned a lot about me, things about donuts and that sort of thing. That's another thing. I love rhyming. Drives my kids crazy because they'll ask me a question. And I'll answer by it with a rhyme. And they hate it when I do that. And I just love it. I love rhyming. And I don't think it is poetry if it doesn't rhyme. I'm one of those people, it's like, you gotta give me the rhymes. Okay? I gotta have the rhymes. As a kid, I loved Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss is always my favorite children's author. And actually, this is one more thing. Whenever I get to know young preachers, like trainees or whatever, guys who are figuring out how to preach, I always give them a gift. I give them a Dr. Seuss book, and I tell them, practice with this. Tongue twisters. There's a walk it in my pocket, that sort of thing. And I say, practice with Dr. Seuss, practice tongue twisters. It'll make you a better public speaker. So, anyway, there's your little thing about that. Anything else then about structure of the book, acrostic, poetry, that sort of thing? Anything else? Kurt, go ahead.
Are we for certain Jeremiah wrote it?
No. No,
because in some of the research I've done and previous studies, some say it could be a compilation of a different author for each chapter.
Yeah.
And then it was compiled when they came together. But they're uncertain that Jeremiah did this for sure.
I think if not universally accepted, I think in Jewish circles, in Jewish scholarly circles, it's almost universally accepted that it's Jeremiah. But I think I don't have any reason to discount any theory about who else it could be. If it's a compilation that was put together at some point, that doesn't bother me or take anything away from the book. Like I said, the majority tradition is that it's Jeremiah who wrote Lamentations, and I don't see any internal evidence to contradict that. So I always go with Jeremiah. I think just the simplest explanation.
With that question in mind, chapter 3 seems pretty convincing to me that would be Jeremiah.
It does. I think some of the language that he uses, the terminology, some of the phrases that are repeated throughout the book, it seems to me at least that linguistically it sure fits Jeremiah, the tone of Jeremiah and the language that he uses.
And his experiences.
Yeah, and his person. Well, like we said, I've pointed out before, like chapter 3 blatantly points out in verses 53 through 55, they silenced me and they put me down into a pit. I called out thy name, O Lord, out of the lowest pit. He definitely was someone who had firsthand experience. He was a eyewitness to the trials and travails during the siege. He is a survivor, and so because he survived the siege, it would make sense that he is someone who would be able to recount these things. Someone who gets killed in the siege wouldn't be able to write about it after the fact. So it makes sense. And the tone of mercy that you see, and also the way the book doesn't end on a happy note. The book ends on a note of uncertainty, which is just like the little knowledge we have about Jeremiah at the end of his life also is pretty uncertain. Jeremiah doesn't have a happy ending. He's taken against his will to Egypt, and he probably dies at some point down in Egypt, a miserable, neglected old man. And so the book, I think, fits the tone of the last thing that Jeremiah might have written in his life. So it fits just tonally. I think it kind of fits. Yeah, well,
Have you already talked about the structure?
You walked in right when we were done. We talked all about the acrostic structure and the number of verses in each chapter and how they correspond, and how chapter 3 is the exception with 66 verses, and chapter 5 drops the acrostic structure. It's not alphabetical. And we talked about why that is, and why would God inspire that? Did God inspire that? Yeah, we explored that a little bit. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, just related to what you were saying, like it might end on an uncertain tone, but the chiasm or the structure points to the middle being the most important.
Oh yeah, chapter 3. Yeah,
not uncertain.
Yeah. That's a good point. The way the book is structured, 22 verses, 66 verses, 22 verses, not alphabetized, right? So it ends on this almost jarring, and I imagine to a Hebrew reader or a Hebrew listener, chapter 5 would stand out much more because it's not the same alphabetical structure as 1, 2, and 4. I bet if you were a Hebrew listener, it would stand out much more. Just like I said, if we listened to poetry that was in English acrostic, and it started with A, B, C, D, E, F, G, whatever, and then all of a sudden I did 4 verses that were alphabetical, and then suddenly did a 5th verse that was not alphabetical, you would probably notice that. So I think a Hebrew reader or listener would notice that. So I feel like because of the change, the book ends on this kind of jarring note. But you're right, the book is written like this, right? It's a pyramid, that points up to chapter 3, especially in the middle part of chapter 3, where it talks about God's loving kindness and compassion, which ultimately, that's what you want to live with. The book is the ultimately applicable message from Lamentations. And I mentioned on Sunday also that even Jews today still read Lamentations during several of their celebrations throughout the year. Even the happy celebrations, they will sit down as families and in synagogue worship and read Lamentations as a memorial for both the temple destruction in 586-87 and in 70 AD. So they read it as a memorial for both temple destructions. So it's, like I said, it's a book that's intended, it seems at least, I hate to make the intentional fallacy, but it's a book that is intended to be read out loud and participated in and celebrated because of its structure. All right, we looked at chapters 1 and 2 in pretty good detail on Sunday. Let's go to chapter 3 now, which is the climax of the book. And I want to look at verses 1 through 18 pretty high level, and then we're going to look at 19 and onward in much more detail. We have pointed out in the past that if you really want to get a good sense of what a chapter is about, look at the action words of that chapter. And if you like to highlight or underline things, this is another one of those passages that's really good for kind of picking out phrases, right? Looking at what are the action words here? What are the verbs that you see? So he talks about being a man who has seen affliction in verse 1, that God has driven me and made me walk in darkness and not light. Now, in verses 3 through 18, follow along with me. We're going to go pretty quickly here. And like I said, if you like to underline these phrases. Look at all of the action words. This is what God does. These are the verbs. God does this. In verse 3, God has turned his hand. Verse 4, he has caused my flesh to waste away. He has broken my bones. Verse 5, he has besieged and encompassed me. In verse 7, he has walled me in and made my chain heavy. Verse 8, he shuts out my prayer. Verse 9, he has blocked my ways. He has made my paths crooked. Verse 11, he has turned aside. He has made me desolate. He bent his bow. Verse 15, he filled me with bitterness. Verse 16, he has broken my teeth. He has made me cower. All right, so with all of those action words thrown out there like that, in a sequence like that, what's the sense you get from verses 1 through 18? What's the takeaway? What's the tone? What's the mood?
It's not pleasant.
It's not pleasant. It's not. What God has done at every turn is unpleasant. Especially this one. I don't know why. For some reason, this one feels more visceral to me. It's maybe because I grew up in a family of dentists. But verse 16, that he has broken my teeth with gravel. That just feels really visceral to me. You only get one set of teeth as an adult, right? And I don't know, there's just something permanent about it. And also something damaging, right? You lose your teeth, it impacts like so much of what you're able to do in life. It impacts your speech. It impacts your ability to eat, what kinds of things you can eat, your ability to sustain yourself, like to defend yourself even on a really basic level. It inhibits your ability to defend yourself. And just even for vanity purposes, it impacts your appearance and your self-confidence. So I don't know, that just really hits me. It's unpleasant. The whole thing taken together is unpleasant. Is it? Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, verses 17 and 18, he's making a very visceral statement there that is just incredibly sad.
Yeah. Yeah, my soul has been rejected from peace. I have forgotten happiness. So I say, my strength is perished, and so has my hope from the Lord. That's an interesting statement, isn't it, given what he says in 3 more verses.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
right.
180 degrees.
Yeah, I mean, it's complete 180, isn't it?
But I mean, that goes back to what I said earlier about chapter 3 kind of going along with that. That's Jeremiah. I mean, you go back.
That's true. Yeah.
You go back and reading Jeremiah. I mean, how many times do we see him throughout that book whining, and then turning right around, and all the glory goes to God.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's kind of what he's doing here.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. There's probably several points that you could look at. If you scan the book, you could probably find several points where it's like, "Woe is me! Everything's awful, but God shall forever be my praise."
Yeah.
The tone shifts quite a bit, but I can appreciate that. I can appreciate that because I have found in my darkest moments that when you're really raw emotionally, like when all the pretense is taken away and all the vanity is taken away, and you don't have anybody to impress, and it's just you and God, and you're praying and you're kind of duking it out emotionally with God, I have found that there's something that's just very purifying about being able to say what I need to say, and the moment I say it and get it off my chest, my own spirit does kind of flip 180 degrees, and it's just very relieving to go, God, I needed to say that, and I'm okay now. I'm ready to move on. I'm ready to keep working, but I really, really just needed to say that. I need to get that off my chest. Yeah, Walter?
Well, I think, in a very real way, that's the very point. And so I think that you can definitely read this as, Jeremiah or whoever the author is saying these things about himself. But I think what the book is doing here is the person who's singing this stuff is a stand-in for Jerusalem and the people of God. Because the description is what God has done to the people, like through the destruction of Nebuchadnezzar. And I think that the whole point is he's painting an awful picture because it was awful and it was the worst. But like for the Jews, even in their darkest time, even when it seemed like there is no hope, they had one thing and one thing always, that they could hope in the Lord. Even if, and I think it's not, I take it a little bit different. I think it's not I just get it off my chest. I think it's I really believe that we are destitute. And it really looks like nothing's going to happen. But I know that God has always come through in the end.
Yeah.
And I don't know how he's going to do it. It doesn't look like he's going to do it. But it jumps into verse 31. For the Lord will not reject us forever. Because like this whole bit of hope is about, it's corporate. It changes from the personal to a corporate. I think that's why he is an analogy for the plight of Israel in general. But the Lord will not reject us forever. That's a strong hope from the Jews.
Yeah. Yeah, look, there's 2 other key verses. Chapter 1, verse 18. The Lord is righteous. That's a key phrase. The Lord is righteous. Chapter 2 and verse 17. The Lord has done what he purposed. And then, chapter 3, verse 22. The Lord's loving kindnesses indeed never cease. His compassions never fail. I think those 3 verses, to me, encapsulate what the book's really all about. God is righteous. We're being punished because of our sin. God is going to do what he does. It is his purpose and his righteous purpose to do what he does. But in the end, he is compassionate. And he is just as compassionate as he is just. Justice and compassion are never, they don't butt heads with each other in the perfect person of God, which, we struggle with justice and compassion. That's why we debate things like capital punishment, right? Because on the one hand, hey, you murder someone, you ought to be killed yourself. I think it's perfectly fair. That person, he murdered 17 people. We should electrocute him. And other people say, how can you cast the first stone? You've got your own sins. How could you kill anybody when you also have made mistakes? Okay, I get it. There's a debate about that, right? And humans have that debate. And yet with God, justice and mercy, they're never, one never wins out over the other. They're equally important parts of him. And the justice and the mercy are intermingled with each other. And so we know that justice has its place. Justice also is balanced out by incredible compassion that God has. And we trust that both of those things are true. I trust the Lord is righteous and his will is done. Sometimes that will is unpleasant. Sometimes that will involves punishment. But I also know that God is merciful and compassionate, and his loving kindness never ceases. And those two things are both true. Don't ask me how it works. I'm not God, and I don't have a brain as big as his, so I don't pretend to fully understand it. But I do know those two things are true, and I allow for both of them to be true. Yeah, well.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, I think that it's a really important point to take out of this book. And I would even argue that, like, God's justice and God's mercy are two, important and fundamental aspects of God. But I would actually argue that the Bible kind of seems that it shows that God's mercy is actually more than his punishment and his wrath. Like the Exodus passage where it says, the Lord is kind and gracious, slow to anger. He says, I will show mercy and gracious on the righteous to 1,000 generations, but I will not leave the guilty unpunished to the third or fourth generation. And you got the James verse that says, but mercy triumphs over justice.
Yes.
And even here in verse 33, for he does not enjoy bringing affliction or suffering on mankind. And I think that's important for what you were saying about we kind of see like, oh, capital punishment, he deserves this. Punishment is almost like a vengeance thing necessarily. I'm not saying that aspect's not there with God.
Yeah.
But in the end, like, God does not want anybody to perish. God takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked, right?
Yeah.
So his punishment is not just arbitrary, oh, you deserve this, I'm just going to, cast you off. In fact, verse 31, it says the Lord does not cast off forever. I think it's just a really important point to pull out as the whole book is pointing to these verses to say, this is the at the most fundamental nature. It doesn't mean God just looks over sin, God doesn't punish. Obviously, the whole book is about the punishment of Judah. But at a fundamental level, God is mercy and kindness, and he loves his people. And he does it for a purpose.
And there's an intentionality to the process, the sequence. The punishment served a purpose. And when that purpose was completed, it gave way to the next part of the process. And we see that process in almost anything. In the work that you do, there's a process that has to happen. And if you misorder any parts of that process, then on a chemical level or on a biological level, the whole thing is impacted or destroyed. Mechanically, in mechanics, it's the exact same way. There's a process that everything has to happen. One thing, it's not more important or less important, but one thing gives way to the next thing as the conclusion. And I'll give you a couple more verses, and then Christy, I'll let you talk here. Verse 39 of chapter 3, why should any living mortal or any man offer complaint in view of his sins? Let us examine and probe our ways, and then let us return to the Lord. Like, oh, wow. That one's hard for me. Like, I have a really hard time with that passage, because it's like, if God did choose to just send me straight to hell right now, like, what case would I have? Like, I mean, what argument could I make? I would have none. No argument whatsoever. Because he is just, and I have fallen short of his glory. Let's loop in another passage that, if you're going to study Lamentations, study Psalm 103 alongside it. They're very, very good parallel passages. Psalm 103, because Psalm 103 does the same thing as the book of Lamentations. It includes a lot of action words by God, okay? And some of the action words are all about mercy. He uses words like pardon, heal, redeem, crowns your life, satisfies your years, performs righteous deeds, compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness. But take a look at this idea here. And this goes to the point that Walter's making, that God ultimately, he's more compassionate than he's required to be. He's more compassionate than we deserve for him to be. Look at verse 8 of Psalm 103. The Lord is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness. He will not always strive with us, nor will he keep his anger forever. That's actually almost exactly quoted in Lamentations 3. Same idea there. He has not, and look at verse 10. He has not dealt with us according to our sins, nor rewarded us according to our iniquities. Well, what does that mean? What does it mean that he's not dealt with us according to our sins, nor rewarded us according to our iniquities? What does it mean by that?
I didn't really deserve it.
Yeah, I deserved a whole lot worse than what God has given to me. A whole lot worse.
Ryan, the New King James translate that, nor punished us according to our iniquities.
Yeah, same idea.
Instead
Same
of
idea that
rewarded.
he has not given to me what my sins deserve. Yeah, he's not punished me. He's not meted out to me the consequence of what my sins warranted. Yeah. Christy, you had a thought a few minutes ago. You raised your hand and then I blew right past you.
And that's fine. It's kind of just, I mean, I know there's a verse, I cannot find it, but it says, he'll have mercy on who he has mercy.
Mm-hmm.
He'll have justice on who he has justice. I mean, he's, like you said before, if he sends us straight to hell, who are we to say he was wrong
Yeah.
in doing that? But then it also says in James, there'll be no mercy for those who have not shown mercy to others. So I mean, I think there's some, again, it's just unfathomable to know the omniscience of the Lord and that he knows the hearts when we do not. Because we were talking about how difficult parenting, that balance and parenting, justice and mercy, but thankfully God actually knows the heart of each person. We're gonna occasionally get it wrong. We're gonna occasionally think one thing and misjudge our child or another person, but God's not going to misjudge someone or their heart.
Nothing's going to slip past him. And that's why verse 25 is so important. Lamentations 3. Going back to Lamentations. Sorry, I'm making you bounce around a lot here, but verse 25 is so important. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the person who seeks him. It is good that he waits silently for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for the man that he should bear the yoke in his youth. Let him sit alone and be silent. It's patience. Patience. And that's really, really hard. So before we read, I do want to read in its entirety verses 19 through 38, because that is the climax of the book. It deserves to be fully read. But let's remind ourselves a little bit of chapter 1 is all about desolation. Daughter of Jerusalem, or daughter of Zion, is made desolate now. Chapter 2 is all about the Lord's anger, and the Lord is righteous in his justice. He's righteous. Chapter 4 is all about the siege. Horrible experiences. We're all starving to death. We have nothing left. The kings and the princes are now crawling on the ground, and we're all striving to just find any morsel of food, any rat crawling on the ground. It even got so bad. Is it okay for us to even eat our babies? The fact that you even asked that questioning, like maybe we should just kill our babies and eat them. So that's what surrounds all of this, okay? And yet, in the midst of all of this, kind of like when you're at an antique store and you're kind of pawing through all the stuff, and then all of a sudden you find that one thing that stands out that you know, or like Jesus talks about the pearl of great value, right? In the midst of all of this sadness and darkness is this. Verse 20, surely my soul remembers and is bowed down within me. This I recall to mind. Therefore I have hope. The Lord's loving kindnesses indeed never cease, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I have hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the person who seeks him. It is good that he waits silently for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man that he should bear the yoke in his youth. Let him sit alone and be silent, since he has laid it on him. Let him put his mouth in the dust. Perhaps there is hope. Let him give his cheek to the smiter. Let him be filled with reproach. For the Lord will not reject forever. For if he causes grief, then he will have compassion, according to his abundant loving kindness. For he does not afflict willingly, or grieve the sons of men, to crush under his feet all the prisoners of the land, to deprive a man of justice in the presence of the Most High, to defraud a man in his lawsuit. And these things the Lord does not approve. Who is there who speaks and it comes to pass, unless the Lord has commanded it? Is it not from the mouth of the Most High that both good and ill go forth? Why should any living mortal or any man offer complaint in view of his sins? Let us examine and probe our ways, and let us return to the Lord. We lift up our hearts and our hands toward God in heaven. We've transgressed and rebelled. Thou hast not pardoned. Thou hast covered thyself with anger and pursued us. We'll go ahead and stop there. Okay. A couple of phrases that just really stand out as, I feel like, really applicable. The phrases that just really stick out to me. I think that the whole passage is beautiful. Clearly, even in English, even not in its original language, it's clearly a passage that's meant to be read out loud. It's just a beautiful, beautiful passage that pulls us along lyrically, poetically. But I really like this phrase from verses 26 through 29, this idea that wait silently for God, bear your yoke, sit alone and be silent, and put your mouth in the dust. Like there's just an idea of there's a time to just be quiet and just accept what life is, and just put your hope in God. You don't have to have an opinion on everything. You don't have to lead a revolution. Like sometimes God isn't asking us to lead revolutions and fight giant battles, and sometimes God is just saying, we should spend some time thinking on this. Go to your room and think about what you've done. Sit silently, think about what you've done. I don't always punish my children when they do bad things. Okay, I don't always give them a spanking or take one. Sometimes it's just a matter of, I need you to think about what you've done. I want you to process a little bit. Go to your room and be quiet for a little while, or sit with me because their room is full of toys. I'm going to banish them to a room full of toys and whatever. But just let's sit together. Or sometimes I say, get in the car, let's go for a drive. Let's just go for a drive for a little while. Let's go spend 20 minutes and just drive around. Let's be quiet and let's think about things. And then when you're ready to talk, let's talk. That to me seems like what he's saying is, bear your weight, bear your yoke, sit and be silent, let God do his thing. What does he mean when he says, put your mouth in the dust? If you put your mouth in the dust, perhaps there's hope. What does he mean by that?
You're praying.
Yeah, I mean,
you're bowing.
Literally, get down and put your face in the dust. Get down and put your face in the dust. Like there's a time to prostrate yourself and pray in that way. We traditionally in churches of Christ, we're a fairly buttoned up crew for the most part. We like, when we're sitting in worship, we like to keep our hands down here, and keep your hands. We don't worship God with our hands. And I do think, and I lament a little bit, that we are such a buttoned up crew because there's something that's missed when you don't engage different parts of your body in worship. And I'm not suggesting, Brian, I'm not suggesting that we get up and we sway back and forth. I'm just saying that, when you're praying, how frequently do you just get down on your hands and knees and pray on the ground? I don't pray often enough, but I'll say the times that I do pray with my face in the dust and my face is on the ground and I'm fully prostrate, that's a very memorable prayer. And that's a prayer that you really feel because your whole body is engaged in this thing. So I say literally. I think there are times, literally, when you lift your holy hands up to heaven, lift your holy hands up and pray to God. Reach out to your Heavenly Father, physically. When you're prostrate in spirit, be prostrate on the ground. Physically, there's something tactile, there's something, you're connecting, your whole body's engaged. There's just something to be said about that. Walt and then Jacob.
Yeah, I was going to say, well, we actually lose that connection in English, but the word for worship, especially in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament too, literally just means to prostrate oneself.
Yes.
Like it has, like that's the content. Like if you read the Old Testament where it says he prostrated before him, it's the same. In Hebrew, it's the word for worship. Like there's no distinction. So that's what the word literally means.
Yeah, exactly. Jacob?
I was going to say, I think it's also special coming from, if this is Jeremiah, even more so than if he was quoting God. I think literally Jeremiah is saying this because we know he surely did all these things.
Yeah.
So coming from him after what we read in his book and now through Lamentations, I think brings it's even louder than coming from another source maybe.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, Yeah, Jeremiah he just makes the most sense as an author. Jeff?
I have a handwritten note in my Bible from when this was studied some years back. It's credited to RG, and I can't remember who RG is.
Ryan Goodwin.
If it was some years back.
No, because it was
No,
some
I
years
know.
back.
Yeah.
I know.
And it says, God doesn't need your opinion on everything. Be silent and wait.
Yeah. Robert Goodman? He was a member here, wasn't he?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I've been probably further back than that.
Maybe further back than that. Well, God doesn't need your opinion. And sometimes we just clutter things up through long and fancy prayers. Sometimes when I pray, it's a more physical experience than a verbal experience. When I need something, I will get down on my hands and knees, put my face to the ground, and just say, God, you know what I need. Let me just prostrate myself here and call upon your name. And God doesn't always need to have the jumble and the confusion. Because we talk ourselves into things also. Sometimes as there's a temptation that while we're praying, maybe a little bit it shifts into what I'm praying is I'm saying things to convince myself of something. And I'm not just allowing the moment to be what it is. I don't know if you've ever experienced that. I have. Kevin, and then let's look at some other stuff here. Go ahead.
Well, I'd say if you take it that way, then those verses that you read about putting your hope in the Lord, His mercies renew every morning, really contrast well with this idea of you prostrating yourself in your prayer and your worship.
Yeah.
Because you let yourself go, and you can do that because of these promises that God has made. And God's character. It allows you to just, I can empty myself because God is faithful in everything that He does. And that tomorrow, or the next day, or the next year, or whatever it is going to be filled with mercy.
Yeah.
And I can take the punishment now. I can deal with it. I can pray and do all that because I know His mercy is going to be there.
And the other side of that too is it's nice to know that God is not a psychopath. Because look at what He says. If He does cause grief in verse 32, He will have compassion. Because it's not like God didn't wake up that morning. God is not some psychopathic kid with a magnifying glass burning ants going, look at the way they squirm. If God causes grief, He will have compassion. Verse 33, he doesn't afflict willingly. He doesn't just want to grieve the sons of men, to crush them under His feet because He's got some sick pleasure in it. God's not a psychopath. And I think it's much easier accepting your discipline from earthly parents, accepting your discipline from society's justice system, right? If you are accepting a punishment or a discipline from people who are benevolent, humble, thoughtful, who only punish because it's a last resort, because they've tried everything else before the punishment, I think it's a lot easier to take it. I hope that I'm like that with my kids. I hope they recognize, like, when Dad disciplines in this way, he doesn't enjoy it. Dad's not a psychopath. Dad is not, it's not some sick pleasure he gets in tormenting us. But Dad does this unwillingly, or rather, only out of necessity does Dad behave in this way when he does. So I think it's nice to know, and I know it's kind of joking, right? And of course, God's not a psychopath, but it's nice to know that God's not a psychopath when all this is happening. You get the last word, Drew.
I was just going to get to that morning
Oh, that was it?
because you want to get to the last bit.
Oh, so the last passage here in chapter 5, it does end on a weird note. O thou, O Lord, dost rule forever. Verse 19 of chapter 5. Thy throne is from generation to generation. So, yeah, that's great. God rules forever, from generation to generation. So why do you forget us? Why do you forsake us for so long? Restore us to thee, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old. Unless you have totally rejected us and are exceedingly angry with us.
Keep reading, there's got to be more.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. It's chilling. It's a chilling way to end the book because it's a reminder. It's almost like, okay, all right, we have a future. We have a future. But we better have learned something from what's happened with all of this. And it's a challenge to our faith as well. These things are easy to say. Can you live them? Can you actually put them into practice? All right, thank you so much. Appreciate all your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I didn't see y'all coming in here. How are y'all? Good to see you.
Yeah, well, we got a few more things.
Okay, that's what I figured.
And the stuff from their house that we get rid of, stretch over there.
Well, I have my number if y'all need some help with something. I don't know if you finished it. Just let me know.
Yeah, we're, all the stuff we can handle is just cramming. We brought her flex, and I've got
You know what? I saw the flex out there. I was like, last time I saw the flex was the Ellis's. And then I come in and I see it. I was like, okay, it makes sense because I remember seeing it. Yeah, we can do it.
Sunday.
We'll see.
We moved off the work today, tonight, we're gonna do some more packing.
Yeah, I think
This might be the last time in Memphis for a long time.
Sad, like we had our trouble yesterday and looked at stuff.
Her brother did, yeah,
I was
he's
like, I
offered to
don't
do
know
it
when
this
we'll
time.
ever come back to
If she had
Memphis
come,
unless Lucky gets a permit.
Well,
You know, unless you
Yeah.
want to see
Never
her
know.
or something. Or pass it through to go somewhere else.
He didn't
I'm
really
sure
know
we're
she
going to be
was
feeling the same type of thing next year. I'm
Maybe
already
you are.
trying to
Yeah.
deal with emotions and all that type of thing.
So they're leaving tomorrow to go to Asheville. They get back Monday. So she's already been over there. She was over there Monday. And then she'll go over there Sunday.
Yeah. Well, we married up. What do you say?